The standard modus operandi of record making, by the time I was established as a producer, was to think in terms of songs, 3 or 4 minute songs, because that's what radio was willing to play. And the goal for most records was to get it on the radio, to get some part of it on the radio, as much of it as you possibly could. And when I got around to doing A Wizard, a True Star, and started reconsidering all of my prior assumptions, including how the record should be made, I began to realize that the advance of technology had given us the long player. Previous to that, it was the 45, and the 45 could practically fit up to maybe 5 minutes worth of music on it. And I realized this was the reason why there were bands on an LP. The spaces in between the songs was because everyone was habitually thinking in these 3 to 5 minute chunks. And I thought, what if I just sort of ignored that aspect? What if I didn't think about how long the song went on? If I only got through a minute of it and thought, okay, that I've sort of expressed that idea, I felt no obligation, to write a bridge and another verse or anything like that. I would just, that's enough of it, we'll move on to something else. By the same token, I didn't think a song had to be restricted to a certain length. If it was going to go on for 7 or 8 minutes, fine, that's what it's supposed to do. If it's a medley of songs, well, that's, people have played medleys for a long time. I'm just going to do a medley of my favorite songs. And then I'm going to go into another one of my songs. It'll be a little ditty that's, a minute and a half long, and then do some other thing. There was no rules on purpose. There were no rules, and I was trying to convey what goes on in a musician's head, or for that matter anyone who has music in their head, what goes on before you get to the sort of formalities of trying to turn it into this exactly 3 minute long expression. And so I essentially would sort of consciously cut the process off before it reached its obvious conclusion, and try and then imprint that onto the tape, and try and not go back and resist the temptation to kind of dress it up or change it in a certain way. If it seemed to require that, then I would just say, okay, stop it there and go on to the next thing. And it's kind of a challenging thing, because there's the constant temptation to try and complete it or to put it in a certain more familiar context. And if I had been in a more traditional sort of studio situation, I might have succumbed to that temptation. But since there were no hours, there was no clock, there was no billing, there was nothing that, none of the other things that always reminded you were in the studio. And eventually we got out of the head of being in the studio at all. That we were just making music, and we just pushed that button over there before we did it. And that, as much as anything, became the character of the record. But it's the anti-record in a way. The whole idea was, let's not think about this the way we've thought about all the other records we've made. In fact, let's not think about it at all. let's just start getting as much as we can down the tape. I'll figure out how to deal with it later. And ultimately, that's what happened. As a result of this idea of removing the distractions of record making and focusing solely on the musical ideas, as a natural consequence, you're not keeping track of how much music is being made. And suddenly when you figure, okay, I've got enough, as it turned out on many of my records, it would be too much. It would be more than the technology could bear, in a sense. And A Wizard, a True Star must have gone through at least a half a dozen different masterings, just trying to figure out the ideal combination of of equalization and limiting and other sorts of processes that you have to go through in order to make sure that the grooves are adequately deep in the vinyl. And the longer a record is, the more shallow the grooves get, and the shallower the grooves get, the quieter the sound is, and the more likely the record is to skip. And my records became exercises in mastering science at that point. They were all coming out longer than a normal record because I was no longer thinking in terms of songs that were supposed to live in any other context. They were only, in my mind, they only lived on the record, and they lived between this song and this song, and if they ever found it to the radio, it's whatever, you know. But from my standpoint, I was evolving into an album artist. And I was not the first album artist. There were plenty of album artists. The Beatles were probably the first album artists. When they put out Sgt. Pepper, and there were no singles on it at all. And there were songs that sort of ran into each other, and it didn't seem like they had, you know, a conventional concept when they went into making the record. They were trying to do something different. And over the years, that became the sort of a template for any number of artists to look at the LP as their primary medium of expression, as opposed to the 45. And as time went on, you know, a number of my records that I never intended to be double albums had to be turned into double albums because of the excessive length of them. And whenever we could avoid that, then we would go through these, you know, mastering tortures trying to get an excessive amount of music onto vinyl. And when CDs came out, I looked at it as sort of like a boon to all of those old LPs, because they could be remastered and played at top volume without skipping, you know, or anything like that. So that was something of an advantage to me. The disadvantage was that usually you go back to the last stereo master you used to make the vinyl, and as I say, we've done so much sort of processing on those to make them fit onto the vinyl that I think a lot of my records would have, and maybe possibly someday will, improve in terms of the overall sound quality, because we'll go back to the original intent and remaster from, let's say, an earlier version of the mixes, or even mix them all over again, just so we can take advantage of that. But to this day, I still don't know how to maintain a sense of what is the appropriate length for a record, because a couple years ago I put on an album called Liars, and that pretty much pressed the limits of what could go on a CD. It was like over 80 minutes long. And just because I'm not paying attention to how long it is when I'm doing it, I'm just doing it until I either exhaust myself or until I think, well, that's enough. You know, it's enough for now. I'll do something later to incorporate these other ideas.